Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar today. We're just going to get started here in just a couple seconds while more people are joining. So please bear with us and please review our housekeeping guidelines while you're waiting. Thank you. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here to introduce the SGS webinar for cosmetics and ESG, the sustainability mandate. My name is Lawrence Muchnick. I am the National Sales Manager for certifications and audits for the cosmetic and personal care industry. Today, your speaker is Adam Hames. He's the Director of ESG here at SGS. I'm going to go ahead and leave it off to Adam. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Larry. Today we're going to be talking about a nice agenda. I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining. I know people are still coming on, but we've got a lot to cover and kind of like the highlights out of some of our training and definitely specific to the cosmetics industry. But just thank you for taking your time out of your day. We'll briefly kind of very quickly go through who SGS is. Most of you probably know. But talking about sustainability and ESG, we're going to give some quick definitions and quick history just because that's incredibly important, where this is coming from, how that has led to the 5 North American key drivers today that we're seeing, specifically what's that 5-step cycle look like for cosmetic firms that you're going to implement this stuff, what are the material topics and KPIs, we call that, specifically for the cosmetics industry, we call that the outside in, what are the standards and the frameworks and the rating agencies saying cosmetics should be focused on, and then we'll talk about next steps, which is how do you also get that inside outlook of what's actually happening, boots on the ground. We'll try to leave plenty of time for Q&A, but do type the Q&A in. We'll try to answer them along the way just because it's helpful. If you don't know who SGS is, we are a worldwide boots on the ground leader in testing, inspection, and verification. We have 98,000 employees in 2,600 offices, and we are recognized as the global benchmark for quality and integrity. When we talk about sustainability, just know that it's embedded in our company. It has been for a very long time, from the board to the CEO, all the way down to every employee. In our core principles, it's because we've had over 25 years of experience sitting at the table, creating many of the standards and schemes that are in operation today, and we verify and certify a lot of those schemes as well. So we've always been a player, and we get recognized, as a lot of our clients do, in our own operations and how we perform as a company by all of the major rating agencies and scoring methodologies. So we're very proud of that. So we continue to walk the talk. So to a real quick question that helps get a baseline of where you're at, has your organization published an ESG or sustainability reports? If you've ever published one, maybe it was your first year, but typically those turn into an annual report. And so then answer the question yes, no, or possibly you don't know if you've put one out yet. And those are very acceptable answers just to get a baseline of where we're at. I'm going to give it a few moments because I know people are rapidly putting them in. Thanks for your submissions, by the way. We're going to talk about this a little later about the cycle that we go through, but oftentimes it might take you several years to get to your first report. But once you do put out your first report, we typically see that companies do it annually or at most maybe every 2 years to give themselves some time. But for the majority, we see that this the first time you do it is the longest, and then it might turn into an annual cycle. So if you have done it, kudos to you. If you have not done it, maybe you're in the process, kudos to you for your efforts. If you don't know and you're still interested, hopefully you'll see maybe why it's valuable today. All right, I'm going to show the answers here in about 5 seconds. And what we see is a pretty good balance. Some people don't know. Most are on a no, 23.5% yes. So this is typically what we see. We see a growing need for it, but a lot of folks, especially if you're coming to a webinar on the topic, it's very common that you have not quite done it first, or you have not published your first report. So let's talk about definitions and quick history, because I want to talk about, so you know what we are talking about and what we're not talking about. so we can at least agree. So when I say ESG today, we're talking about, in the simplest form, non-financial reporting. So if that helps you, it is 3 categories. It's very nice that it's 3 categories because it's environmental topics, social topics, and governance topics, but they are never separate from and devoid of or in a vacuum. They're always next to financial reporting, and it's typically coming from publicly traded companies, but that is definitely not the case solely. The ESG movement is really kind of aligning with the sustainability movement, which we'll talk about next. And it's coming out of a very consistent history. So we'll talk about the slow pace of financial responsibility, but it's very directional. And this is not something that just happened overnight, although we're sort of hitting the peak ESG right now. But really quickly, briefly, everything pre-1930, historical cost accounting was how you did accounting. It was accuracy, and that's what people cared about, was historical accuracy of financials. So what happened that changed that a little bit? Well, the Great Depression. In 1929, when the London and New York stock exchanges collapsed, ripples around the world were felt. And the big thing that came out of that were reforms on transparency of information, misleading financial or missing financial information. So 10 years, you'll see these in 10 years chunks. The American Institute for Accountants have a committee on accounting principles. It was called CAP. And in the 40s, they basically said, hey, we really are going to allow exceptions to just historical cost accounting because we realized that what we were asking for in the past wasn't quite good enough. So in the 40s, you opened up all these exceptions. And then by the 50s, they created a new group, the Accounting Principles Board, to replace CAP. And they said, hey, we've got all these exceptions. APB is going to standardize the approach. We're going to figure out some sort of standardized approach to this. We can't just allow any exception. And then by the 60s, 10 more years, they said the entire accounting profession, pretty much worldwide, said historical cost accounting and accuracy isn't the main purpose of financial information and reporting. It's actually decision useful data and for the users of reports, which are typically just investors and financial institutions. So that may seem not like a big deal, but it's a shift that they all agree, say we've got to create decision useful information here, not just accurate. So 10 more years went forward, and in the 1970s, internationally, you had the International Accounting Standards Boards founded, and in the US, we had the Financial Accounting Standards Board, which replaced, or FASB, which replaced the APB, and they actually, for the first time, said, you know, the ESG categories were created. They said, of all the differences, all the different things that we see reporting, they all fall into these 3 categories. And if we're going to continue non-financial reporting, we've got to really agree that there are, one, financial. You've got the future discounted cash flows became a major focus. They also called this just social goals at the time for the S. And then for environmental, it was really environmental externalities that were not included in the price of goods and services. So they said, we're going to start allowing these ES&G non-financial, non-GAAP types of reporting, and those are the 3 major categories. This created sort of the beginning of the shift to intangible assets, whereas in 1975, if you looked at the S&P 500, the total market value, 83% of that was in physical things. So tangible assets, buildings, cars, products, and inventory, things like that. And then so just remember that in 1975, pretty high on the tangible. And then in 1980 in the US, for the first time, we started mandatory management and discussion sections of financial reports. Those didn't exist. And so you have this slow crawl, that's 50 years of financial change, and it really led to just those 3 categories of non-financial reporting. And then you see it start to align with, we go to in a way more detail in our other trainings, but the financial, environmental, and social movements started to work together really in the 1990s for the first time. And kind of what the lightning rod for this is, Ray Anderson was the CEO of a company, Interface, a carpet company, publicly traded. They said, we're going to be mission zero. We're going to basically bring all of the best of the financial world, the environmental responsibility world, the social responsibility world, and kind of create this dream team. And we're going to see if we can do this as a company and become a quote unquote sustainable business. And that really started to create other things to spin off of it. In 1997, the Global Reporting Initiative was created. a major standard still today that was for not only a framework, but a standard for reporting. In 1998, two business writers wrote the first Fortune 100's best companies to work for. And that list was all based on criteria from ESG. In 2007, the Millennial Goals were created. They predated the Sustainable Development Goals, but it was just 8 key goals that they could agree all governments and businesses should be focused on around the world. In 2004, the Global Compact was a corporate initiative out of the UN that had 10 business principles that they all aligned around. 6 were social, I think 3 environmental, and 1 governance. In 2007, that was called the Natural Marketing Institute, did a study that showed 13% of the US population was what they called LOHAS, lifestyles of health and sustainability, and that they would spend more money on environmentally and socially responsible goods and services. So you're starting to see this increase, but then we hit the 2008 Great Recession, where the housing bubble popped in the US. And interestingly enough, most of the things that were kind of big, feel-good community things either plateaued or took a decrease and took a little bump or a dip, but personal health and well-being actually continued to increase, which surprised people, but sort of that stuck. The selfish, like, this is good for me, I want to feel good, I want to be healthy for me and my family, continue to rise even during the Great Recession. So you move forward, 2009, Integrated Reporting Foundation was started to say, hey, we're going to stop reporting things in just these other marketing pieces, and we should report environmental, social, and governance issues if they're material to the business with the financials and side by side. Then SASB was created in 2011. That's the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which tried to basically take GRI and fast track it and said, hey, we've done the materiality assessment for you. Here's 77 industry standards. And here's a list of, I think they average 5 topics, 13 metrics per industry. And you could just take it off the shelf and adopt it. People love it for that reason. People hate it for that reason, but it's there and it's a useful tool. In 2016, the famous BlackRock, the first letter went out about ESG saying, hey, this is the future. We're going to be looking at ESG pretty hard. And everyone started to take interest. And then if you look back at the 1985 or the 1975, where 83% of the S&P 500 was intangible assets, the market value in 2020 was 90% intangible of the S&P 500. So it's a seismic shift in intangible assets. What does that mean? Intangibles are things like intellectual property, goodwill, brand value, and things that are still very important. They're valued very highly, but they're very quick to disappear if you have a bad day in the media, if someone finds out that you were not in compliance with some environmental or social regulation, or if you're just, you do something that you took some sensitive topic that wasn't a tangible market value, but an intangible asset for the company, and that could disappear quickly. And so that's why that risk has grown for companies, and why in 2022, even above COVID-19, climate was considered by the business community around the world. With the World Economic Forum survey, is still the #1 economic risk above all others, including COVID. And so it's continued to be an issue, but governance is really culminating around how do we monetize for businesses, social goals, and environmental externalities. And we'll say that there has never before today been more business tools, frameworks, and standards so that businesses can adopt this type of information, where you even go 20 years ago, it was starting out, it was in the lexicon, but there were no tools and standards and frameworks to speak of, which makes it impossible for businesses to do what they need to do. So fast forward to today, what do we have? Well, I'm clicking on the wrong button, that would help. We have 2 very related but different definitions. So ESG and sustainability are not technically the same thing. People use them in wildly different ways, but today we're going to say ESG is synonymous with financially material but non-financial reporting. So the things that are in an ESG report have been determined to be financial material to the business. So even though you're talking about planet, people, profit, or ecology, equity, and economics, however you want to break it down, ESG is really, what are those impacts on the business? So if there are environmental issues, how does that negatively impact the business, or positively? If there are social issues, how does that impact the business? So it's purely about the business being impacted by the planet and society. But if you add that, as people often say, double materiality, you're adding in impact materiality, which is more of the feel-good stuff that employees and consumers care about. That's also, you don't forget the ESG, but what is the business's impact, negative and positive, on society or on the planet? And that's called impact materiality. That's typically what people mean when they say sustainability, and that's what we're going to use it to mean today. So you kind of start with ESG, but you can grow into more of the good for the world sustainability piece. And there are two very clear tracks when you look at frameworks and standards. The investor community has driven this, and financial institutions, but integrated reporting, SASB, TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate related to financial disclosures. They all joined a few years ago into the Value Reporting Foundation, and just this year that absorbed into IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards. And so all of that is ESG focused, what is the impact on our business, what are these material topics, is very much in a line above that and has now kind of lives squarely in IFRS. Sustainability, that feel good, they've kept separate. GRI and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, they've continued to try to grow and expand, and they've strongly tried to align with the investor community, but they include that double materiality. What's the impact on society from business? What's the impact on the planet or the environment from business? And they've said we're not gonna get rid of double materiality because their purpose is bigger than just the bottom line for the business. But that has provided two very clear tracks to get into and to focus on. And so what does your business see? Do you see stakeholder expectations, whatever those stakeholders may be, for ESG and sustainability performance? Do you see nothing, no expectations, or just no change? Or do you see increasing expectations on ESG and sustainability performance? Or maybe you see decreasing. And there's no right answer. Every industry can be different. Every business can be slightly different. So one thing I would encourage you to listen for is if it ever sounds like we're saying this one thing is true for every single person. That's not true. There is no off-the-shelf solution. It's pretty customizable, and you really need to know the broad principles, but you have to see how they apply to your business. Luckily today we get to talk about more of cosmetics specifically, but I see people chiming in, so I'm going to let you put a little more in there. Same thing some people have said in our trainings, I hope I don't give you the impression it's been a smooth, positive line. That timeline is very general in direction. There's starts and stops. There's reverting back. It's never just been forward progress. And all those things are just to show the general trend over time is clearly in the direction of this is happening. And there's never been more tools available, but there's always bad actors. There's always the frameworks and standards always have room for improvement. But the general tide is heading in a particular direction. I'll give you 5 more seconds. There's still some people clicking in. And let's look at the results. So that's funny. Sometimes we see decreasing, but this is not atypical that most of you see it increasing, or some no, and none or no change. And so just to be clear, what's really important for you is what's happening to your business within the cosmetics industry. But we're going to talk about cosmetics as we go. So what are the 5 North American drivers, given that history and those definitions, what's happening today? So the big one still remains that ESG ratings are influencing publicly traded companies, usually the larger companies, because investors and creditors are using those ratings to make buy, sell, or lend decisions that are very real and very tangible for companies. From the smallest to the largest of who's actually being adopted and how many users. There's the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, which is just the largest 300 companies in the world, so not a lot of people fit into that. There's been Morgan Stanley Capital, that's the MSCI ESG rating system. That's very, very reputable. Most people think very highly of it, but they only have 8,500 businesses listed today in the ratings. ISS, which only adopted an ESG platform maybe in the last 10 years. They were big in the governance side, but they adopted the E and the S. Recently, they have 11,500. Sustainalytics has 20,000. And EcoVadis, which we'll talk about in a second, they're actually the highest and fastest growing rating system, but they're private. All these 4 here that you see whether you want to or not, publicly traded companies have been scored, and that's why some people don't like them, because it's just what's publicly available. They didn't ask, they just started giving companies a score. But those scores are being used, and so that has driven a lot of the movement. And this is very much related to the number 2 driver, which is supply chain customers. Those big publicly traded companies decided that they wanted to have better scores, and it turned out that a lot of the scoring methodologies had supply chain impacts embedded in the score, and the companies were not able to have transparency, didn't have a lot of control or even insight into their supply chain, so that you've seen new things come out where the brands themselves are asking a lot larger number of companies, smaller and medium-sized privately held companies, to first be transparent and disclose those scores and the performance, but then also to start asking them to have better scores, because that's how they improve their supply chain and ultimately their overall ESG score. One example of that is, the greenhouse gas emissions for climate. Greenhouse gas protocol used to be optional. It still is optional. That was sort of the international standard. And then ISO came out with their 26 version of an ISO standard for greenhouse gas, 14064-1, but the 2018 version, which only had 3 years of a window to transfer to the new version, which is now fully applicable. It's not optional. You have to measure your scope 3 or indirect emissions in the supply chain to be compliant with ISO, and that's had a massive shift just in climate change alone. And so what's happening is most of these companies are using either CDP or EcoVadis to make a request, which often feels like a mandate for their suppliers. And that can be hundreds of suppliers, sometimes it's thousands of suppliers. And that's why you see CDP growing. That's just for climate disclosure, but EcoVadis is for a full ESG score in environmental, social, and governance. And EcoVadis is the most rapidly growing, and it is private. It's not publicly available, so there's a lot fewer barriers to entries and a lot less stigma about, oh, everyone's going to see this. But even the cosmetics industry, all these companies that you see here on the right have created the Responsible Beauty Initiative, which is actually founded on top of the EcoVadis platform. And it is getting very specific cosmetic and beauty related KPIs and practices to be standard and use that EcoVadis system, which includes ratings and scores, but to really look at best practices. And so that has been the biggest sort of, I call it the EcoVadis effect. It really opened it up to a ton of small, medium-sized, privately held companies, and it's really the second wave of the ESG and sustainability movement. We do have an ESG rating boost, scoring tool, or not tool, service that we provide, and we're also going to, I think, teach a workshop here pretty soon. Shameless plug for who we are, but those things always matter. Regulations, surprisingly, a lot of people think that only regulation is the key driver, but for ESG, it's so broad that it's usually not the main driver. But North America is also a little behind. So if you look at, I'll jump to the bottom of the slide. If you're in the EU and you have a huge supply chain internationally, it might be regulation. CSRD is a very big deal in Europe. Brazil also has a national greenhouse gas ERS program. Usually it's South America, East Asia, and Europe that are about 5 years ahead of North America. But if you look at Canada and the US, we have our mandatory climate disclosures for large emitters. Now we have both just passed this year, federal supplier rules, so that if you're a supplier to the federal government of Canada or the US, you're going to have to start, of a certain size, you're going to have to start disclosing your climate footprint and setting reduction goals. And then the US has the most pretty aggressive SEC ruling change, which has only been proposed, but it's also around climate. So it's greenhouse gas reporting, but also assurance, third-party verification of that information and setting targets. And people are definitely watching that closely. But you'll notice that unless you're in Europe, most of it centers around not ESG, but North America is very heavily focused on climate specifically from a regulatory standpoint. And then in a distant fourth and fifth, consumers first, low-cost consumers, unless you're in the consumer specifically selling directly to consumer market, which here we are today, this applies much more to you. But some folks don't see it as a main driver, but consumers are asking for this and clamoring for it, and they will continue to. It's a $546 billion global market, but in the US, it's Japan, New Zealand are also very high, but it's increasing at about 10% per year. Of that 23%, I'm not saying it's going to be 33% next year, but it's a nice steady pace. It continues to grow. And then the McKinsey survey recently showed that 70% of all consumers are willing to pay more for green products that perform well, while 50% of companies say that their business growth strategy is actually what's driving their sustainability initiatives, being able to offer new and improved services, enter new markets with a social or an environmental focus for that particular product or service. And so do not ignore the consumer driver. It's definitely from the cosmetics industry going to be playing a much bigger role. And then looking at the employee base and the talent wars, it's just becoming more and more popular for employees to want to work for a company, especially younger generations, but not limited to that. Higher talent workers, more of the knowledge workers, and the hard to recruit positions, especially if you're trying to recruit someone to move to a different place or a different country. They're really looking at what is the company's culture, what does the company stand for. And there's a Unilever survey here and the IBM survey that I'll just say very high percentages, 65 plus, don't believe that their company's doing enough or would prefer to work for a company that was doing more. And so consider that as the talent wars kick off, and especially for those high level positions, it's going to be an issue. So I talk a lot. I'm going to always ask you questions. What's your organization's #1 driver for ESG and sustainability performance? There's usually a primary. Typically, there's 2 or 3 that's a little mix. Every company has its own unique mixture. But what is your #1? If you had to pick a primary driver for why you even came on this webinar, is your ESG and sustainability performance driven by the ratings, driven by supply chain customers, regulations, consumers, employees, or some other? And while I'm waiting, I have, Scott just tried to answer, probably didn't have, maybe weren't clickable, Scott. And Larry says, how do I start the process with SGS to help increase my EcoVadis score? That's fantastic. Just call us after this. We have a ratings boost. We're going to teach a workshop in the not too distant future, specifically because we're hearing a lot of requests for it. But we have a tool specifically. You have to have an EcoVadis score, and so definitely check out your reports. They do give you some information. I think that's helpful, but it can be a little confusing and overwhelming for people to try to dig through it all. And we can make that process a lot simpler. We've got about 50%. I'll give you 5 more seconds. People are still answering. But here is our response. I love them. So no one today from the ESG ratings, but supply chain customers, upstream regulations, and consumers. Nothing on employees, nothing on ratings. So that really helps you focus on where you need to put your attention and the type of programs and the projects that you're going to focus on. It really needs to align with your own business needs. ESG should never just be a kind of flavor of the month or off-the-shelf strategy. So let's talk about the steps that you need to go to as a cosmetics firm. What's it going to look like? And really, we're trying to simplify this. It's a lot messier, but you really need to think about these 5 key steps in a cycle. And I talked about the reporting cycle. Often this will turn into a 1-year cycle, but at the beginning, it could take you 2 to 3 years to get this going. But awareness is first. You have to look at the issues and trends. You have to understand something before you can set priorities, which is step 2. But you're doing a materiality assessment, looking at the risks and opportunities involved. Often this is stakeholder engagement, where the only way to prioritize is to engage with your stakeholders and find out what their priorities are. Then you can create a strategy in step 3. With all the information you've gained, you can create a vision, KPIs, goals, real plans, so that you can execute. And in stage 4, execution is what are you actually going to do on the day-to-day work to get initiatives off the ground, projects successful, maintain a high level of quality, reduce risk, but you have to actually make things happen. And then 5 is reporting. What are you going to report to who? Voluntary, mandatory, internal, external. But typically the things that get reported are both your management approach to an issue and your actual performance. People want to see year over year, how are you doing? And the sequence matters. The reasons it's sequenced in this way is logical, but it also mitigates risk, because Typically with ESG, you're having internal leadership conversations. They can be uncomfortable. You can have disagreements internally. There can be hot button issues in the current, ethos out there in the culture, depending on where you're at. But awareness, prioritizing, and strategy is all internal, and you can have some protection, a little bit of breathing room to really get it right, in your opinion, and to go out with something that you really believe in. And then when you execute, you can't really help it. By the time you execute, definitely your internal stakeholders, your employees, but often your close business partners, they're going to see you doing things differently. So the word's going to start to get out, and then you're going to report publicly. And if you put any public document out there, even if you send it to you hoped it would go to a particular audience, you can't control that message. It's going to be out. It's going to be widely known. And so that's why you're going to mitigate risk by going very cautiously through step 1, 2, and 3, and making sure you create a strategy that fits for your company. For that reason, you're going to have very different people assigned to parts of this 5 steps. Your strategists are your senior ESG committee. There's almost always needs to be a senior level committee or working group or whatever you want to call it that has board, C-suite, VP, and directors, an ESG professional if you have a dedicated person, and often your lead counsel, that they are the group that sees the most about the company. They understand the inner workings. They understand the core business strategy, because ESG has to be tied to your core business strategy. And so you shouldn't have other people, low-level employees, going through and setting your priorities and your strategy for you. It has to come from the top, although you can get input from people, but the senior level is where you need to set that strategy for it to be successful. Then when you execute, you really switch to your implementers, and these people tend to be siloed in different departments, but they're your project managers, your operations managers, your subject matter experts, but you'll have a risk manager, quality manager, any type of typical initiative. You're going to have a day-to-day grind of getting that done and getting it successfully implemented. And then year after year, how do you expand it or maintain? Then you have a different team doing reporting. That's your communication staff, your marketing team, your investor relations or government affairs for legal compliance. Any group that's going to be skilled at telling your story and in very particular ways to meet your needs has to be educated and very good at doing that. You don't just let the technical people do the reporting, although it needs to be technically accurate. You do have different needs for different audiences. So all of that to be said is that there's really those 3 different sets of people, and it's important to know who you are for your organization and maybe who else you need to get engaged to have a successful initiative. What that looks like from the cosmetics industry, it's really great to go to some of these reports, and you'll see, because people are disclosing exactly the process they went through that aligns with what we just said. This is from the Firmenich report that just came out. You've got their section. I only did screenshots of 1 page at a time, but there's much more than this. But first they talk about their governance and what's the process they went through, who's their senior committee from the board on down of how they manage ESG, and they disclose that specifically to show the governance piece, and you know that this is the group that came up with the strategy. Then they show you the results of their prioritization. Usually that's in a materiality matrix like this, where you can say, hey, here's our priorities and why. Typically what backs this up is stakeholder engagement, because that's where you get the X and Y axis rating. And then you have the contents. What they actually created from their strategy is what are the topics that we're focused on, which also tells you at the same time what are the topics we're not focused on, and then how are we going to measure that performance. And then there's a lengthy breakdown of that in the rest of the report, which typically is about 60 to 100 pages. Here's Cody. They have another governance section where they do more of like just paragraph describing all their policies and governance of how they approach it. Here's their actual stakeholder and stakeholder engagement piece, where they say, here are the different stakeholders that we actually engage with to determine our priorities, which there's 9 different stakeholder groups there, which is pretty robust. And then their contents, you can see they broke it out into beauty of product, beauty of planet, beauty of people, and then a lot of different contexts. That's usually the governance section around here. And you can go through their full report to see the KPIs. So this is how you approach and why you have these kind of sections in a report, because it's really the process that you went through to create it. So who are you and what's your role inside of your company? What are the steps of the ESG cycle that fit strongest with your current job role? Are you a strategist who would be on the ESG committee, senior level? Are you an implementer that owns energy or owns waste or owns DEI or owns health and safety? You're going to be implementing that day to day. Or are you a reporter? Are you on the team that's going to put that report together at the end and send it out to investors on the financial report, or send it out to customers if it's a ESG and sustainability report separately? Or are you a compliance reporter who has to talk to the EPA or some other entity that just needs very specific types of reporting? Because if you know your role, you'll know maybe who's missing from the team to complement you, but you'll also know what kind of training you need to take, because you shouldn't be taking reporter training if you're an implementer, and maybe you shouldn't take reporter training if you're a strategist. You should take things that really fit your roles and what you're going to be asked to do for the company. And I see quite a few people chiming in. I'll give you about 10, 15 more seconds. Any questions, if people have them, if you want to throw them into the Q&A box. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This is a really nice balance. Oftentimes we'll see a lot of strategists coming to the webinars because they're at the beginning stages. But if you're an implementer, I would just say, make sure there's a strategy coming to you, because it's hard to implement something if you're not clear on the strategy. And if you're a reporter, also look back and say, is the strategy in place? Do we have a good implementing team assigned? But this is a really nice balance for today, so I'm glad you're all on here. I will again plug that we believe in what we're teaching, because we have courses that specifically align for a day for strategy, a day for execution, a day for reporting. If your role, you can take all of them. People who are like an ESG director or are responsible, if they're the one person at their company, you can take all three and it's not really a problem. You'll have great background. The foundation course is only 2.5 hours. It's video on demand, but it's a prerequisite for all the others. And there's tons of other, if you know it specifically, what frameworks and stuff, you can dive right into something very specific. But we believe in training, and we would never recommend just jumping in without some training, even if it's not from us. And then let's talk about the cosmetics. So topics and KPIs. For this industry, we're talking about outside in. It's really helpful. It's not the only way to look at it, but a lot of these framework standards, ESG rating agencies, they have been doing this for 1 or 2 decades. Most of them have a multi-stakeholder process where industry has been at the table helping them to determine what the priorities are. And so it's not the only thing to look at, but it's a great place to start. So if we look at cosmetics specifically, governance, and this is almost every industry, governance is what people say is most important. You have to have a structure in place to manage ESG, because it's core, it's financially material, even though it's called non-financial reporting. But these are ESG topics that are supposed to be financially material to your business. So you have to have management in place for it. So the types of disclosures you'll get are senior governance structure. What are the names and qualifications of those people? What's the stakeholder engagement process you went through to identify risks and opportunities? Describe your management approach to every material topic that you chose. Usually you have from 8 to 12 topics. And then if you're certified to any standard of a governance level, if you have a huge supply chain, they also want to know, often it's limited to tier 1, but what % of your tier 1 suppliers are certified to any governance standards, and then do it by type. So governance is almost always the #1 leading type of disclosure. And then we get into kind of a mix. So from cosmetics, packaging and waste tends to be the highest. It's not the only one, but it's slightly higher than the others. You'll have things like packaging made from recycled or renewable materials, packaging that's recyclable, reusable, and or compostable, any strategies to reduce the life cycle environmental impacts of your packaging. And then again, are you certified to a standard, and are your tier 1 suppliers certified to any standards? Because supply chain management is becoming big. If we look at next, chemical safety, what's actually in the product, you can consider that both an environmental and a social, because cosmetics go on our skin. People definitely care what's in it when it's touching their skin, but also the chemicals used, if they're harmful in the manufacturing of that product, get into the environment and impact soil, water, things like that. So examples are products containing REACH substances, very high concern, products also containing substances. The California has the DTSC candidate chemicals list. Also, you can have revenue from products designed with green chemistry. That's more of a positive outcomes type of disclosure. And then your process you go through to identify and manage any emerging materials with chemicals of concern. Following quickly behind that, these are all fairly pretty high, but environmental, the carbon footprint. Again, if you saw just across all industries, climate tends to be, especially from a regulatory standpoint, the highest. So it's not rare that it's in the top 2 or 3. For cosmetics specifically, it's not uncommon for you to see just a product carbon footprint, which requires an LCA, life cycle assessment, but then also a full company carbon footprint, which is scope 1 and 2, which are direct and indirect emissions, and then scope 3, indirect value chain emissions. If you're using ISO, it's actually called categories 1 through 6, but most people talk about it from the greenhouse gas protocol. So you'll hear things like scope 1, 2, and 3. Then whether you're certified to any climate standards, so using an acceptable ISO or ISCC or greenhouse gas protocol, and then do you have tier 1 suppliers also participating? Are they certified to any climate standard, or is your supply chain even disclosing any emissions information whatsoever? We do have fantastic greenhouse gas training. Again, these are 4 modules. You don't have to take them all, but it goes up to, from a beginner to as rigorous as we actually train lead greenhouse gas verifiers. You could come work for us and do verifications. It's a very highly technical field, but you would have to take all 4 courses, but you can also take them one at a time, and they're incredibly valuable, especially the third one. Companies who want to get a verification of their emissions inventory, it tells you how to set up your team, what to expect from the verification body, which is SGS, and how to prepare your team for that. Environmental material sourcing. This is really talking about where you get all of your stuff, certification to any environmental standard when you're getting sourced, but also your tier, or for your own company, but when you're sourcing from your tier 1 suppliers, are they certified to any standards? 2 very common ones are palm oil from the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, RSPO, but also just water. Water is an increasingly risky business for everyone around the world. Depending on your region, it's even more critical, but they want to know often how much water do you withdraw from different sources, and are they in extremely high or high water stress areas, or how much water you consume in your process overall, if it's not withdrawn from a river or another body, like an underground aquifer. And then just a discussion of your water and management risk strategies. Product quality is sort of last. It's usually falls under social, but it is pretty high. It's just kind of standard practice, but are you certified to a quality standard or a tier 1? Do you have tier 1 suppliers certified? ISO 9001 is the most common one, but in cosmetics, obviously we have ISO 22716 as well. So these are incredibly valuable quality standards to be looking at. And then labor standards. How do you treat your people? This is becoming more and more of concern, but it's a little further down than all the others I've mentioned, specifically for the cosmetics industry, when you look at the frameworks and standards. But we have the certification to any social standard, a few examples I put here, but there are quite a few that you could choose from. And then are your tier 1 suppliers certified to any social standards? Usually you break that down by type. You have DEI and different disclosures, which are gender, race, all kinds of other diversity stats in the workforce and in leadership positions. Then often it's community giving, charitable giving, and employee volunteerism, and a description of the impacts it has on the communities that you serve. So those are a handful. Those are the most important ones when it comes from the outside in. When you look at the frameworks, you look at the standards, that's the order that we see. But you could also do your own. A formal materiality assessment would help you determine for your business specifically, not just what the standards say. And the question is, have you done that? Have you conducted a formal materiality assessment, typically with some stakeholder engagement, or just a benchmarking exercise that has you able to see what are our material topics that we should be focusing on, and you've got data to back that up. All right, a lot of people chiming in. I can't tell you enough that from where I sit, materiality assessment of any kind is just incredibly valuable. Again, if you don't want to do something off the shelf, which I never recommend, if you want to know that something is material to your business specifically, it's great to know your industry, it's great to know your competitors, but anything off the shelf, you run the risk of not setting up the most effective ESG strategy possible, which is absolutely tied to your core business strategy. So that's why I highly recommend it. We'll see what the balance is, which is fantastic. This is what we see often, yes, and it can be varying degrees. If you're in Europe, you have to do something called a double materiality assessment. It has to be impact assessment and financial material assessment. So it has to have both that we talked about earlier. No is very common as well. I don't know. It's kind of common because it kind of goes in waves. Sometimes it used to be very common for people to put the results of the materiality assessment in their report. And sometimes that doesn't happen for varying reasons. Sometimes they had it in for 3 years and they just feel like, hey, we don't need to keep putting the same one. But maybe they're updating it, but it's not uncommon for you to not know, but go look at any past reports or talk to senior or not. And then have you gotten any third-party assurance for ESG and sustainability reporting? And that's because a lot of the regulations definitely coming out of Europe are starting to require third-party assurance, or it's called for greenhouse gas, which in the United States and Canada is most common. You'll see some what's purely on, hey, you need to get your greenhouse gas emission inventory verified. That would be A, or multiple ESG KPIs. It's when you do KPIs, it just means that you pick 7 or 8 as an example, social and environmental KPIs that were your most important ones, and you verified their accuracy. That's the assurance piece. Or you can do a whole report. You could say, hey, our entire report is GRI compliant, or is SASB compliant, or is AA 1000 compliant. There's actually entire frameworks and standards that you want to be compliant to. That's kind of the most robust types of assurance you can get. Or you could just say, no, we haven't done any assurance, or you don't know. Typically in the report itself, there's little check boxes, or they'll put a full copy of a certificate from someone like SGS and say, hey, here's our certificate. You know, it's proof to the public that we have provided a certain level of third-party assurance to our to what we're reporting or what we're claiming as a company. Give it a few more seconds to see what people say. So nobody in the GHG, nobody in the multiple KPIs, but we have somebody with a full, or 2 somebodies with a full report, and a lot of no's and I don't knows, which is common. I would say Europe is the big driver of assurance from an ESG standpoint, and that's only slowly starting to kind of blossom and ramp up in the US and Canada, unless you're a large public company that has that supply chain. But it is growing, and we see more of it, so just keep a heads up. We have verification assurance. We also have something called a gap analysis, which is our form of a right size. We can right size it for you. It's a materiality assessment, but we can right size it for the size of the company and how aggressive you want to be in that first year. And then what's coming up next, before we open up to Q&A, I just want to talk about what's really important is the inside out, not just what frameworks and standards and rating agencies are telling cosmetics companies they need to do, but what's actually happening in the field. And so what we're conducting is our own cosmetics research, where our team is going to go out and we're going to launch a webinar in Q3 with the results of this, but we're going to do the top, I believe it's 100 companies now, I should have updated that, in the cosmetics industry, and say, what are they actually doing? What are their reporting behaviors and trends? What frameworks, standards, and ratings are they using? What are the material topics and priorities they're setting? And what measurable KPIs and targets do they have, as well as any third-party certifications, verifications, and assurances. So we are excited to be able to report that back to you in the future. So keep your eyes open for the next notice, but we hope to do that in Q3. And that's also incredibly important, because the frameworks and standards are great, but what is happening from a competitive stance with your peers and what seems to be getting the most traction is incredibly valuable information. I will let Larry talk about this, because I forgot we threw this in, but we do have a very specific cosmetics training for ISO 22716. And Larry, do you want to?
Yes, thanks, Adam. So yes, have you ever wondered about how to internally audit your own facility or space? This is our ISO 22716 internal auditing training. We also do have an introduction to 22716 also that ties into this. I have attended it, and I got to tell you, it is fantastic. It's so not a snooze fest. Our training people are awesome at what they do. They keep everybody engaged, and I highly recommend that you check it out. We have a class coming up in August 8th and 9th, and in October for the 12th and 13th in USA and Canada. We will also send out links to you post webinar that'll have all the links that you can attend for trainings like this, and we'll also provide you a post webinar video with all the slides too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think that's it. Questions from you. I try to leave 10 minutes, so hopefully that's enough. I didn't see any Q&A come in through the box, but type them into the Q&A section. I don't know that we can unmute ourselves, but I'm happy to stick around for as long and any questions that you have.
We did have one that came around that EcoVadis, and I could say in this industry, it's such a huge thing. What would you say is like a typical timeline of how we help the customer in getting increased their EcoVadis score, and how many audit days? What's the process on that, Adam?
Well, it depends on what they need help with. We do something called the rating boost, which is just we request certain reports from you. There's a certain 4 documents that we ask, and it's all mostly desk research because we have people in the cosmetics industry who have copious knowledge, and we've been serving cosmetics for a long time. So we're able to put together something very quickly that gives you basically a full roadmap of quick wins, short-term, long-term, or short-term, medium-term, and long-term projects. And it's also prioritized on 6 different criteria because EcoVadis has all these weightings and categories. But the full amount of work is maybe 3 to 4 days for us, depending on if you want something more. But that's something that's very accessible for people. And it provides you the next 5 years, you have a nice plan. It is a little bit of chasing points. And so we always encourage people to consider the gap analysis, because that's less about the algorithm that the rating agency is using, and it's more about your company specifically. Those 2 things go really well together, hand in hand. But we can go much longer. If people want a consulting role where we can actually get in and kind of do some hand holding and consult, we can do that. But we found that some people want something smaller. So we've got this, the rating boost is more of a very defined engagement, and then we step away and leave you with a really great, very detailed, easy to understand report.
Fantastic. Yeah, so if your company has an EcoVadis score of bronze or silver and you're interested in getting it increased, we'll be happy to field your questions and possibly schedule a call and walk you through exactly what we do.
Other things that people have asked with ESG is just, should I wait for the SEC proposal? So if you're familiar with the SEC, it's been in the works for over a year. It was a climate disclosures for the United States specifically, but it covers a large number of companies. And I think looking at it and really understanding that it's a climate disclosure piece specifically, it's not that broad. It's not CSRD from Europe. So if you haven't looked at climate internationally, there is no bigger issue. It consistently is the #1 issue in every region. All regulation tends to start with climate regulation and then expand into something else. So it doesn't benefit you to wait because it's not that complex. And so I would just suggest that look into the SEC ruling. What is it exactly? And really it's just telling you, measure your carbon footprint, get it verified, and set some reduction targets. And if you're interested in those 3 things, SGS can help.
I see a question came in from Pat. Can I get a copy of today's PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, Pat, you will. And I think it's going to go out, and because you're here, you're registered, you will get an email blast that says, I think through the recording as well as the slide deck.
Yes, and please stay tuned. We have a lot of great engaging content to come for the cosmetic and personal care industry, as well as MOCRA and ESG. So as well as we'll be posting our presentation that we had at the Cosmoprof trade show that also goes over ESG, Adam.
What's something you noticed at Cosmoprof, Larry?
I noticed that there's a lot of great innovation coming in the cosmetic industry. And with innovation comes a lot of certifications and audits and awareness. With MOCRA especially coming around the horizon, it was a very interesting show, and I could tell you like a lot of people that came to the booth were having these type of topics top of mind.
Perfect. Yeah, I was at a different event in Georgia, and otherwise I probably would have tried to go with you.
Next time, there's one in Miami. You got to come to that one.
Sounds good. Is that January?
That's in January.
Perfect. Maybe I'll see all of you as well. If you're at Cosmoprof, we'll see you then. But yeah, I haven't seen any more Q&A come through. Hopefully that's because we're super thorough, or maybe, tell us your questions you wish we would have answered. But we'll be here willing to answer anything you have. But I think we're at the end and we got it done in time. So I'm glad, Summer, that I left room for Q&A and that I didn't go over time today. Two things that I struggle with.
So I will go ahead and just say that this is a wrap. I want to thank everybody for joining the session. If you do have any questions that come up post-webinar, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll be happy to assist you and answer those questions. Thanks again for joining the session, and have a great one.